After 38 years, The Godfather's Al Pacino breaks his silence about Diane Keaton, revealing untold truths and decades of secrets. There are smiles that simply light up a room, and then there's Diane Keaton. It's not just bright or charming, it's disarming. It's the kind of smile that says, I'm fine, even when she's not. The kind that hides 1,000 stories, 1,000 contradictions, a lifetime of balancing between vulnerability and poise, chaos and control. Diane Keaton has lived her life like one of her characters, complex, offbeat, magnetic, always a little outside the box. For more than 5 decades, she has been the embodiment of Hollywood's most cherished contradiction, the woman who makes imperfection an art form. But long before the Oscar, the hats, and the legacy, she was simply Diane Hall, a dreamer from Los Angeles who believed that life could be something extraordinary if she just found the right way to tell her story. Diane Hall was born on January 5, 1946 in Los Angeles, California. Her family lived in a modest house in Santa Ana, not far from the glittering promise of Hollywood, but worlds away from its glamour. Her childhood was not defined by luxury, but by imagination. Her mother, Dorothy Hall, was the heartbeat of the household. A homemaker and an amateur photographer, Dorothy possessed the kind of creativity that doesn't demand recognition. It simply flows through everything one touches. Dorothy encouraged Diane and her siblings to express themselves, to perform, to create. Their living room became a stage, their backyard a set. For young Diane, the boundaries between everyday life and performance blurred early. Her father, Jack Hall, worked as a civil engineer. His work often took him away from home, which left Dorothy to raise the children largely on her own. In that absence, Diane learned independence. She developed a fascination with storytelling, perhaps as a way to fill the quiet spaces left by her father's long absences. The world outside their modest home was booming with post-war optimism. Suburbia was spreading, television was changing the American psyche, and dreams of fame were becoming as common as the cars rolling off the new assembly lines. But for Diane, the dream wasn't about celebrity. It was about connection. She didn't crave the spotlight for its own sake, she craved the chance to live many lives, to understand people from the inside out. While her friends fantasized about Hollywood, Diane fantasized about Broadway. Theater, she believed, was the purest form of truth. It was raw, unfiltered, immediate. As a teenager, she became obsessed with musical theater, idolizing performers like Judy Garland and Carol Burnett, women who weren't just glamorous but fearless. After graduating from high school, Diane set her sights on New York City, that electrifying heart of ambition where every street corner seemed to hum with possibility. Her parents were supportive, if slightly bewildered. The Hall family had no connections in show business, no roadmap for success. But Diane had something rarer: conviction. She enrolled at the neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater, one of the most respected acting conservatories in New York. There she studied under the renowned Sanford Meisner, who preached the importance of truth in performance, of reacting honestly, not pretending. The Meisner technique, with its emphasis on emotional authenticity, would become the bedrock of her acting philosophy. Yet New York wasn't kind to dreamers. Diane worked as a waitress between auditions, often struggling to make rent. She lived in tiny apartments with creaky floors and shared bathrooms, but she loved every minute of it. Every rejection, every failed audition, every night spent reading lines in front of a cracked mirror was part of the story she was writing for herself, one of persistence and discovery. In 1968, after countless small auditions, Diane landed her first significant stage role in the groundbreaking musical Hair. It was more than just a job, it was a cultural earthquake. Hair wasn't merely theater, it was protest, liberation, the embodiment of a generation tearing down the old rules and rewriting them in color and chaos. Diane was cast as a replacement in the Broadway ensemble, and though she wasn't one of the show's stars, her presence was unforgettable. She refused to participate in the show's famous nude scene, a choice that made her both a rebel and a curiosity. But that defiance was pure Keaton. She would challenge convention, but always on her own terms. It was during her time in Hair that Diane met a quiet, neurotic, and brilliant young comedian named Woody Allen. He was preparing his new stage play, Play It Again, Sam, and when he saw Diane's audition, he knew she had something special, an awkward grace that made imperfection magnetic. Woody cast her immediately, beginning a creative partnership that would shape both of their lives. Play It Again, Sam premiered on Broadway in 1969, and audiences were captivated by the chemistry between Allen and Keaton. She wasn't like anyone else. Her delivery was unpredictable, her timing instinctive, her laughter infectious. She made neurosis feel charming and honesty feel revolutionary. Offstage, their connection deepened. Diane and Woody became romantically involved, though neither would call it traditional. Their relationship was a mix of deep affection, mutual respect, and creative obsession. They inspired each other, sometimes lovingly, sometimes through friction. When Woody transitioned from stage to screen, he took Diane with him. She appeared in his early films like Sleeper and Love and Death, but it was Annie Hall 1977 that changed everything. The film wasn't just a romantic comedy, it was a new kind of storytelling. It broke the fourth wall, defied genre conventions, and turned personal neuroses into poetry. And at its center was Diane. Annie Hall wasn't originally titled that. It began as Anhedonia, a story about the inability to feel joy, but as production went on, the focus shifted. Woody realized that the emotional truth of the story wasn't about him, it was about her. The character of Annie Hall, neurotic, charming, unsure, authentic, was Diane, reimagined through film. Even the name Annie Hall came from her real-life nickname, and her signature style, the wide ties, the vests, the floppy hats, were her actual clothes. Costume designer Ruth Morley later admitted that Diane's personal wardrobe inspired the film's entire aesthetic. The movie was a revelation. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and most memorably, Best Actress for Diane Keaton. At 31, she was suddenly one of the most recognized faces in Hollywood. But fame didn't change her. When she accepted her Oscar, she was still awkward, humble, unguarded, and utterly herself. She didn't try to fit into Hollywood's idea of a leading lady. Instead, she made Hollywood come to her. After Annie Hall, Diane could have coasted on her quirky charm. But she didn't. She began seeking roles that challenged her, that forced her to shed the protective humor and explore darker emotional territory. In 1972, she had already impressed critics in The Godfather, playing Kay Adams, the wife of Michael Corleone Al Pacino. When The Godfather Part II arrived 2 years later, Diane's performance deepened. Kay's transformation from naive spouse to embittered partner mirrored Diane's own evolution as an artist. She wasn't merely the woman beside the man, she became a symbol of moral reckoning. The moment when Kay confesses to Michael that she aborted their child, that haunting, trembling defiance, remains one of the most powerful scenes in cinematic history. Through the 1980s, Diane's career became a balancing act between introspection and expression. She starred in Red's 1981 alongside Warren Beatty, another of her famous romantic partners, delivering one of her most emotionally charged performances. She also directed, photographed, and produced, exploring her creative curiosity beyond acting. Her directorial debut, Heaven 1987, was an experimental documentary that reflected her fascination with the absurdities of belief and mortality. Through it all, the public adored her, but few truly knew her. Diane Keaton cultivated an image that was both open and impenetrable. She seemed candid in interviews, yet somehow always held something back. Her famous laugh, that big, uncontrolled burst, became her signature, a defense mechanism as much as an expression of joy. She never married. She spoke often about love and relationships but refused to romanticize them. Her partnerships with Woody Allen, Warren Beatty, and Al Pacino were all deeply meaningful but ultimately fleeting. In her own words, she wasn't searching for a prince, she was searching for herself. By the 1990s, Diane began to redefine womanhood on screen. In Father of the Bride, Something's Gotta Give, and The First Wives Club, she portrayed women with humor, intelligence, and emotional depth, women who had lived, lost, and learned to laugh again. In an industry that often sidelines women over 40, Diane became proof that maturity was magnetic. Her charm didn't fade with age, it deepened. When Diane wasn't acting, she was building literally. An obsessive architecture and design enthusiast, she began restoring and flipping historic homes across Los Angeles. She approached houses like she approached characters, intuitively, passionately, and with a deep respect for history. Her coffee table books like House and California Romantica became bestsellers. They revealed another layer of her creativity, an eye for texture, light, and nostalgia. Diane's aesthetic, a blend of rustic California charm and timeless elegance, mirrored her own identity, rooted in tradition yet fearlessly unconventional. In her 50s, Diane made one of the most important decisions of her life. She adopted 2 children, Dexter and Duke. Motherhood transformed her. After decades of focusing on art, ambition, and love, she turned inward toward the quiet, unpredictable joy of raising children. She often said that motherhood gave her a new sense of purpose, a reason to be less self-conscious, more grounded. In her memoir, Then Again, 2011, Diane wrote about her mother's journals, hundreds of pages of handwritten reflections that Dorothy had kept throughout her life. Reading them after her mother's passing, Diane realized how deeply her own creativity and vulnerability were inherited. Her mother's longing for expression had become Diane's legacy. By the time Diane entered her 70s, she had become more than an actress, she was a symbol. Her style, her wit, her refusal to conform had inspired generations. Young women who once idolized her in Annie Hall now saw her as proof that aging could be artful, that individuality never goes out of fashion. She continued acting, often blending humor and melancholy, as in Hampstead 2017 and Book Club 2018. But her real masterpiece had already been written, her life itself. She once said, "Style is just attitude. It's not about fashion, it's about how you see the world." And that's perhaps the essence of Diane Keaton. She sees the world through a lens of curiosity, never cynicism. She finds beauty in mistakes, charm in awkwardness, grace in imperfection. In an industry built on reinvention, Diane Keaton never pretended to be anyone but herself. She didn't chase youth or trends, she chased truth. Her characters, from Annie Hall to Erica Bari, resonate because they mirror the contradictions within us all. The longing to be loved, the fear of losing ourselves, the courage to laugh through the uncertainty. Diane taught Hollywood and the world that authenticity is timeless. She remains a reminder that vulnerability isn't weakness, that a smile can carry both joy and sorrow, and that sometimes, the most radical thing a woman can be is herself. If you watch Diane Keaton on screen, really watch her, you'll notice something rare. Between the laughter, the eccentric outfits, and the playful banter, there's a moment she always returns to: silence. In that silence, you can feel her searching for connection, for meaning, for something true. It's the same silence she learned as a girl in her mother's living room, when the world felt vast and her dreams still out of reach. Diane Keaton built a life from that silence, a career, a legend, a legacy. Behind the hats and laughter, behind the smile that has become her signature, lies a truth as beautiful as any role she's ever played. Diane Keaton didn't just act in stories. She became one. And somewhere in another corner of destiny, her silence met his noise. Before he was The Godfather, before he was Scarface, before he became a legend whispered about in acting schools and backlot corridors, Al Pacino was just a boy from East Harlem. Born Alfredo James Pacino on April 25, 1940, he grew up surrounded by noise, the kind that never stops, the kind that comes from tenements bursting with families and dreams. The rhythm of the streets was his first soundtrack, the blare of radios, the shouts of vendors, the occasional siren slicing through the air like a warning. When his father left the family, Al was only 2 years old. His mother, Rose Gerard Pacino, packed what little they owned and moved in with her parents in the South Bronx, a world of cramped apartments, cheap rent, and survival. It was there, under the care of his strong-willed Sicilian grandparents, that Al learned what endurance looked like. They didn't have much, but they had stories, stories of the old country, of loss, of love, of pride. And for a boy like Al, those stories were oxygen. But poverty leaves marks, so does loneliness. Al grew up shy, withdrawn, a kid who fought not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Street fights were a way to be seen, he once said. You fought to exist. And yet, even then, there was something in him, a spark, a hunger to be more than what his surroundings dictated. He watched people the way a painter studies light, carefully, intensely, memorizing their gestures, their pain, their humor. The streets were his first classroom, humanity his first teacher. In school, Pacino wasn't the kid teachers celebrated. He was restless, distracted, always lost in daydreams. But when he discovered acting, almost by accident, something clicked. It was as if he had finally found a language for everything he'd never been able to say. He began performing in school plays, and for the first time, he wasn't invisible. When the lights hit his face and the audience fell silent, he felt a strange, electric sense of belonging. He realized that acting wasn't just about pretending, it was about telling the truth. After dropping out of high school, Pacino struggled to find his footing. He worked odd jobs, messenger, janitor, busboy, anything that paid the rent. But at night, he devoured plays and films. He studied the faces of Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Montgomery Clift, trying to understand how they made honesty look so effortless. He auditioned for drama schools across New York but was rejected again and again. One school told him he was too short, another that he was too ethnic. But Al Pacino wasn't built to quit. In 1959, after years of rejection, he was finally accepted into the Actors Studio, the legendary New York institution led by Lee Strasberg, the high priest of method acting. That moment changed everything. The Actors Studio was a temple for the tortured, the passionate, the obsessed. Inside its walls, fame didn't matter, truth did. Strasberg pushed his students to mine their souls, to dig into their pain, to live inside their roles until the line between life and art disappeared. Pacino became one of Strasberg's most devoted disciples. He wasn't content to act, he needed to be. He would spend hours rehearsing a single line, studying human behavior in cafes and subway stations, watching how people moved, how they hid their emotions. He lived in cheap apartments, often eating only a slice of bread or an orange for dinner. He couldn't afford acting classes some weeks, but Strasberg saw his raw power, that coiled intensity that could erupt at any moment, and took him under his wing. Pacino later said, "Lee taught me that acting isn't about performance. It's about remembering who you are when no one's watching." That lesson became the cornerstone of his career. For years, Pacino floated through New York's underground theater scene, small plays, small audiences, and even smaller paychecks. But something about him stood out. Directors noticed his commitment, his unfiltered realism. He wasn't glamorous, but he was magnetic. His first big recognition came in 1969 with the play Does a Tiger Wear a Necktie, for which he won a Tony Award. That performance, raw, dangerous, human, caught Hollywood's attention. And among those who took notice was a young director named Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola was preparing a film adaptation of Mario Puzo's best-selling novel The Godfather, and he needed an actor who could embody the transformation of Michael Corleone, a man who begins as an idealistic outsider and becomes a ruthless ruler. The studio wanted big names: Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, even Jack Nicholson. Coppola fought for Pacino. The studio executives resisted. They said Pacino was too small, too unknown, too unproven. But Coppola saw something they didn't: that quiet volcano simmering beneath the surface. Finally, after months of resistance, Pacino was cast. The decision would change film history forever. When The Godfather began production in 1971, no one could have predicted what it would become. The cast was legendary: Marlon Brando, James Caan, Robert Duvall, and now this untested kid from the Bronx. Pacino approached the role of Michael Corleone with meticulous intensity. He studied soldiers returning from war, researched Sicilian family dynamics, and isolated himself from the rest of the cast to embody Michael's growing detachment. On screen, the transformation was breathtaking. In the opening scenes, Michael is gentle, almost fragile, a war hero who wants nothing to do with his family's criminal empire. But as tragedy and loyalty intertwine, something dark begins to awaken inside him. By the film's end, the soft-spoken young man has become a cold, calculating Don, and the world has gained one of cinema's most haunting antiheroes. Pacino's performance was hypnotic. He didn't shout, he didn't overact. He let silence do the talking, and that silence was more terrifying than any outburst. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination and catapulted him into stardom. But it wasn't just a professional milestone. It was personal, because it was on that same set that he met Diane Keaton. When Diane Keaton walked onto the set of The Godfather as Kay Adams, she was the polar opposite of Michael Corleone: light to his darkness, laughter to his restraint. Their chemistry was immediate, electric, and entirely real. Off-screen, their connection deepened into something both tender and turbulent. Diane, with her humor and eccentric warmth, saw through Pacino's brooding intensity. She brought out his softness, his playfulness, his humanity. For Al, Diane was a mirror reflecting both what he loved about himself and what terrified him. She was unafraid of emotion, while he often buried his. Their relationship would last in various forms for decades, sometimes lovers, sometimes friends, always connected. "I was crazy about him," Keaton would later admit. "He was the most charming man alive, but impossible." Pacino himself once said, "Diane was a bright light. She had this thing: she could make you forget who you were for a while." On screen, their love story became mythic, a symbol of the eternal tension between love and ambition, tenderness and power. Off-screen, it became one of Hollywood's most quietly enduring relationships, not bound by marriage or convention, but by mutual respect and emotional truth. The success of The Godfather was just the beginning. The 1970s belonged to Al Pacino. He followed up with a string of masterpieces that defined American cinema. Serpico, 1973, as an honest cop fighting a corrupt system. The Godfather Part II, 1974, deepening Michael Corleone's descent into darkness. Dog Day Afternoon, 1975, portraying a desperate bank robber in one of the most emotionally explosive performances ever captured on film. And Justice for All, 1979, where he tore through the courtroom with righteous fury, giving audiences the now iconic line, "You're out of order. The whole trial is out of order." Each role was a battle between morality and madness, between the man Al Pacino was and the demons he was brave enough to show the world. He became the face of a new kind of acting: raw, emotional, unpredictable. Where other actors performed, Pacino confessed. He brought the theater to the screen, and audiences couldn't look away. But fame for Pacino was never comfortable. He was a private man trapped in a public legend. He avoided Hollywood parties, preferred walking alone through New York streets, disappearing into the anonymity of the city that raised him. He once said, "The theater keeps you honest. Movies can make you forget what's real." In the early 1980s, Pacino stepped away from Hollywood for a time. He returned to the stage, performing Shakespeare and Chekhov, searching for the purity that fame had nearly stripped away. When he returned to film, it was with a vengeance. In 1983, Pacino took on one of the most polarizing roles of his career, Tony Montana in Scarface, directed by Brian De Palma. The film was a violent, operatic descent into greed and excess, and Tony Montana became an icon of ambition gone mad. Pacino threw himself into the role with terrifying commitment. He studied Cuban immigrants, practiced the accent relentlessly, and even burned his hand on set during a gunfight scene, refusing to stop filming. When Scarface was released, critics were divided. Some called it vulgar, overblown, even cartoonish. But audiences saw something deeper, a tragic figure who mirrored America's obsession with power and success. Over time, Scarface became a cult phenomenon. The image of Tony Montana, gun in hand, face twisted in rage, became part of pop culture's visual vocabulary. For Pacino, it was more than a role. It was a reflection of his own inner conflict, the hunger for greatness and the cost of achieving it. By the 1990s, Pacino had nothing left to prove, and yet he never stopped chasing truth. He starred in Sea of Love, Donnie Brasco, The Insider, and Heat, films that explored loyalty, deception, and the human cost of ambition. In 1992, after 7 nominations and decades of waiting, he finally won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Scent of a Woman. His portrayal of blind, retired Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade, equal parts bitter and soulful, was a masterclass in emotion. When he shouted "hoo-ah," the world cheered not just for the character, but for the man who had earned every scar along the way. But behind the triumph, Pacino remained restless. He never married, though he had long-term relationships and children. He once said, "I'm not built for marriage, I'm built for obsession." His obsession wasn't with fame, it was with the work, with the search for truth in every role, every line, every silence. Through all the decades, Diane Keaton remained part of Pacino's story. Their relationship ebbed and flowed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always charged with affection. They reunited on The Godfather Part II and again decades later in public events, still sharing that unmistakable bond. Diane often joked that Pacino was impossible, emotionally evasive, endlessly searching, but beneath her teasing was respect. "He's an artist," she once said. "You can't hold on to artists, you just have to love them from where you stand." For Pacino, Diane was a reminder of what grounded him. Amid the chaos of Hollywood, she represented something pure, someone who understood the price of chasing perfection, yet chose joy anyway. In many ways, they were mirrors, both children of broken homes, both shaped by New York, both unwilling to settle for anything less than truth. As the years went on, Al Pacino became what he once feared, a legend. But unlike many legends, he didn't fossilize into nostalgia. He kept working, kept experimenting. He played Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, Shylock again on stage, and even directed films like Looking for Richard, 1996, a documentary blending Shakespeare and street life, intellect, and instinct. He acted opposite new generations, from Johnny Depp to Robert De Niro, from Christopher Nolan to Greta Gerwig, always proving that fire doesn't fade with age. He earned new accolades in the 2000s and 2010s for Angels in America, The Irishman, and House of Gucci. Each role, no matter how big or small, carried that signature Pacino tension, the quiet before the storm, the explosion of emotion that felt both unpredictable and inevitable. When asked what drives him, Pacino often pauses, as if the question itself is an act of meditation. Then he says something simple: "I'm still learning." That's Pacino in essence, never satisfied, never settled. To him, acting isn't about mastery, it's about exploration. He once told a class of young actors, "If you ever think you've figured it out, quit. The mystery is what keeps you alive." And that's why even now in his 80s, he still approaches every role like a student, curious, open, hungry. Al Pacino's story isn't one of comfort or convention. It's a story of endurance, of a boy who came from nothing, built a life out of his pain, and turned silence into art. He redefined masculinity on screen not as invincible but as vulnerable. His characters cry, rage, doubt, and love deeply. They are contradictions just like him. He never sold out, he never stopped pushing, he never stopped asking, what else is there to find? That's the secret of Al Pacino, the man who never settled. Not for fame, not for love, not for perfection. He has always been chasing something deeper, the truth behind the mask. Somewhere in New York, you can still imagine him walking the streets in a long coat, head down, lost in thought. The city hums around him, the same city that raised him, tested him, and finally embraced him. He might stop to watch a young actor rehearsing in a park, smile quietly, and remember the days when he was that kid, hungry, scared, alive. He has lived 1,000 lives on screen, but in truth, he has always been playing the same man, the one who refuses to give up, who keeps searching for meaning in every face, every silence, every breath. And perhaps that's his greatest performance of all. Not the Don, not the gangster, not the hero, but the man who never stopped becoming. In the summer of 1971, on a dimly lit soundstage that smelled of cigarette smoke, old wood, and ambition, two young actors met for the first time. She was Diane Keaton, all nervous laughter and spontaneity. He was Al Pacino, quiet, guarded, and watchful, a storm contained within a single pair of eyes. They were there to film The Godfather, a movie that neither could have known would change their lives. But even before the cameras rolled, something passed between them, not quite flirtation, not quite fate, but something that hummed below the surface. He looked at her as though trying to solve a mystery. She looked at him and saw one she'd spent years trying to understand. On screen, they were Kay Adams and Michael Corleone, lovers bound by duty and divided by destiny. Off-screen, they were two souls orbiting each other in the strange gravity of art, drawn together not by convenience, but by recognition. Something about him, his stillness, his discipline, his quiet torment fascinated her. Something about her, her unpredictability, her humor, her warmth, disarmed him. It was not a love that announced itself. It was a love that unfolded in whispers. The Godfather set was both sanctuary and crucible. Coppola demanded precision, truth, silence. The actors lived their roles as if under a spell. Diane, with her background in comedy and theater, felt at first out of place, surrounded by men with dark suits, darker eyes, and an almost religious devotion to the story's intensity. And then there was Al, quiet, unapproachable, and brilliant. When he wasn't on camera, he would sit alone, smoking, lost in thought. He barely spoke. But when she passed by, something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. One day, between takes, she made a joke, something silly, spontaneous, meant to break the tension. He laughed, really laughed, and she would later recall that sound as the moment she fell for him. He had this intensity, she said years later, but when he laughed, it was like sunlight breaking through a storm. For him, Diane was a contradiction. She was unfiltered in a way he could never be. She didn't hide behind silence, she filled it with wit, warmth, and life. They began spending time together quietly, dinners in New York, late-night phone calls from hotel rooms, stolen hours after shooting. Neither of them wanted to define it, and maybe that was why it worked, at least for a while. Love between artists is never simple. It burns differently, more fiercely, more destructively, more truthfully. Pacino was consumed by his craft. He lived in his characters, disappearing into them so deeply that sometimes even he couldn't tell where they ended and he began. Diane understood this, she was an artist too, but that understanding didn't make it easier. When the cameras stopped, he would retreat. He would vanish into himself, needing solitude like oxygen. She, on the other hand, needed connection. She thrived on conversation, affection, laughter. He thrived on silence, on the tension between what was said and what was not. He once told a friend, "Diane makes me feel like I can breathe, but being with her also means I can't think." Their love was magnetic but mismatched. They wanted each other deeply but spoke different emotional languages, and yet they couldn't let go. For 16 years, their lives intertwined across films, across cities, across changing seasons of fame. They would break apart and return again like the tide, inevitable, unpredictable, and eternal. When The Godfather was released in 1972, both Diane and Al were thrust into a world of acclaim and attention neither had been prepared for. The movie became an instant classic, a seismic event that altered cinema forever. Al Pacino became an icon of intensity, Diane Keaton a symbol of authenticity. But behind the glamour, their bond deepened in private. In many ways, The Godfather mirrored their dynamic. Michael and Kay, lovers separated by ambition, morality, and silence, became extensions of Al and Diane themselves. As Michael withdrew deeper into the world of the Corleone family, Kay stood helplessly outside it, begging for honesty, for connection. Off-screen, Diane found herself doing the same. "I used to look at him," she said years later, "and feel like I was staring through glass. I could see him, but I couldn't reach him." Yet even when he pulled away, she stayed. Maybe she believed she could save him, or maybe she just couldn't resist the mystery of him. He didn't promise her forever. He promised her honesty in his own quiet way. "I can't give you what you want," he once told her, "but I can tell you the truth." And for Diane Keaton, the truth was enough until it was. Throughout the 1970s, their love flickered on and off, complicated by the demands of fame and the ghosts of their own insecurities. Al's star rose with Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, and The Godfather Part II. Each role seemed to take a piece of him. He poured himself into his characters until there was almost nothing left when the cameras stopped rolling. He would disappear for weeks, sometimes months, unreachable. Diane tried to understand, but loneliness has a way of turning understanding into resentment. Meanwhile, she was rising in her own right. Annie Hall turned her into an icon, a symbol of individuality, humor, and emotional honesty. The world adored her. And yet, amid the applause, she still thought of him. "I'd be at these glamorous parties," she recalled, "and all I could think about was whether Al had eaten dinner." When they reunited to film The Godfather Part II, the chemistry was stronger than ever, but so was the sadness. Their characters mirrored their reality even more painfully. Kay, still loving Michael but refusing to live in his shadow, became Diane's most personal performance. The moment when she tells Michael she's leaving him felt almost too real. As the cameras rolled, it wasn't just Kay saying goodbye, it was Diane too. In the years that followed, Diane waited not passively, but with the kind of quiet endurance only someone deeply in love can understand. Al would drift in and out of her life, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years. When he called, she answered. When he appeared, she opened the door. Friends warned her gently that she was wasting her heart on someone who would never stay. But Diane wasn't naive. She knew exactly who he was and loved him anyway. "I loved him for what he was," she said, "not for what I wanted him to be." But as she grew older, something in her began to shift. The same independence that had defined her as an artist began to demand space in her personal life. She had built a career on playing women who found strength in vulnerability. Now she needed to live that truth. In the mid-1980s, after 16 years of a love defined by almosts and maybes, Diane finally asked for clarity. "Marry me," she said, "or let me go." He looked at her, the woman who had loved him through success and solitude, who had seen the best and worst of him, and said nothing. Then he turned and walked away. It was, she would later say, the moment her heart finally broke, not with anger but with understanding. After their final parting, both carried the echo of what they had shared. For Al, Diane became the one who got away, the light he could never quite hold, the warmth that haunted him through the long, solitary years. For Diane, he remained the unfinished sentence in her life's story, the love that never resolved, the man she never stopped caring for. They didn't speak for some time. Hollywood moved on, life moved on. Diane became a director, a writer, a mother. Al continued to work, to explore, to lose himself in his roles. And yet, whenever they were in the same room, something unspoken flickered between them, a recognition, a tenderness untouched by time. When they reunited years later at public events, photographers captured smiles, laughter, and that unmistakable spark. Two people who had loved each other deeply and survived it. They had become living reminders that some connections never fade, they only change shape. Looking back, both spoke of their relationship with warmth and honesty. There was no bitterness, no blame, only gratitude. Diane, in her memoir Then Again, called him the most extraordinary man I've ever known. Al, in interviews, described her as a treasure, someone you don't forget. They never rekindled their romance, but they never truly lost it either. Their friendship endured, quiet, unpublicized, steady. And in many ways, that was the truest form of their love. Two artists who understood that some stories aren't meant to have neat endings. To the world, their relationship is remembered as one of Hollywood's great what-ifs. But to those who look closer, it's something deeper, a parable about the price of authenticity. Both Diane Keaton and Al Pacino built their lives around truth, artistic truth, emotional truth, personal truth. And truth by nature is not always comfortable. They didn't love each other perfectly, they loved each other honestly. He was the darkness searching for redemption. She was the light that refused to be dimmed. Together they were balance and imbalance, harmony and discord. They taught each other what it means to love without possession, to admire without ownership, to let go without forgetting. Their love wasn't built to last forever, it was built to transform. Years after The Godfather Part II, long after their romance had faded into memory, Diane was asked whether she regretted loving him. She laughed that same free, radiant laugh that had once melted his walls and said, "No, how could I? It was Al Pacino." There's something poetic in that, in her acceptance, her lack of bitterness. And perhaps that's what made their connection so enduring. It was never about possession or control. It was about two people who found in each other what they could never find alone. Even decades later, when she spoke of him, her voice would soften. And when he mentioned her, his eyes, that famously unreadable gaze, would light up for just a moment. Time had not erased them. It had only made their story quieter, like a melody that never quite fades, lingering somewhere just below hearing. In the mythology of cinema, few couples are as eternally linked as Diane Keaton and Al Pacino. Not because they lasted, but because they didn't, and yet somehow they never really ended. Their relationship mirrored the very essence of the human condition. The longing for connection, the struggle between independence and intimacy, the beauty of loving even when it hurts. Through Michael and Kay, the world saw a reflection of themselves, lovers divided by time, by pride, by unspoken truths. Through Diane and Al, that reflection became real. They blurred the line between performance and life so completely that even today, it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. That's the magic of their connection. It exists in the space between fiction and reality, between what was said and what was felt. Now, decades later, both stand as icons, legends whose names are spoken with reverence. But behind their separate legacies lies a shared chapter written in quiet glances, in the way he looked at her across a crowded room, in the way she spoke of him with tenderness long after goodbye. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino taught us something profound about love. That not all endings are failures. That some loves are not meant to be lived, only remembered. And that sometimes, the truest love stories are the ones that never find closure. It began on a movie set under harsh lights, in the make-believe world of a family bound by crime. But what grew between them was real, fragile, fiery, imperfect, and true. They met as strangers, loved as equals, and parted as legends. He was the man who never settled. She was the woman behind the smile. Together they created something timeless, a love that existed somewhere between light and shadow, laughter and silence, art and life. And though it ended with quiet heartbreak, it endures in every frame they ever shared, in every look that passed between them, in every whisper of what might have been. Some love stories are written in ink. Theirs was written in light, and it will never fade. Diane Keaton, actress, filmmaker, style icon, and eternal romantic, leaves behind a legacy of wit, courage, and vulnerability. Her films, from Reds to The First Wives Club, celebrated complex women who loved fiercely and lived freely. Her death shocked Hollywood. Friends like Woody Allen and Warren Beatty expressed their grief, but none felt the loss like Pacino. Those close to him say he sits quietly now, reflecting, replaying their moments together, her laughter on set, her teasing humor, her quiet strength. A man who mastered words on screen now has none left to say. Perhaps in another life they might have found their forever. But in this one, Al Pacino will always carry the memory of Diane Keaton. The woman who loved him enough to ask for everything. And the one he'll spend the rest of his days wishing he'd said yes to.